What I want to do briefly in this video is I want to discuss the idea of abstract concepts versus concrete concepts. This is very important in economics, especially where we're going, that we understand that there are certain concepts that we as humans share, and some of them we can characterize as concrete, and others we would characterize as abstract. Now, concrete concepts are very easy to recognize. They're also very easy to measure. So concrete concepts are easy to measure, whereas abstract concepts, they're difficult to really wrap your mind around. And they're typically, when we want to measure them and understand them and compare one unit, like a person, to another person, that it's difficult to measure that abstract concept and compare one person to another person. So abstract concepts are difficult to measure. And I'm just going to give you one example, and hopefully this is a good example. If you don't understand, you may want to seek further clarification. Maybe you could send me an email or something. Let's talk about height of a person as compared to intelligence of a person. If I were to ask you, what is your height? You might be able to answer that question very quickly. You could say, well, I'm 5'7". And how do you know you're 5'7"? In fact, are you 5'7" every day? Probably yes. If somebody asked me, how tall are you? I'd say I'm about 6'1". And I have been 6'1" for about probably 3 decades. And my height hasn't really changed. But generally speaking, our height is very clear. Our height as people is easy to measure. All we do is we stand up, somebody gets a tape measure, or you go to the doctor and stand against that thing where they put lift the thing up and put it against your head, and it's very clear, very concrete, your height, how tall you are. We do not argue about how tall someone is. If two people were arguing about how tall someone was, it'd be very simple to resolve the conflict. You could just go get a tape measure and measure their height, and then the argument would be over. Everyone would have to agree, assuming they agree that the tape measure is a good tape measure, how tall that person is. But intelligence is very difficult to measure, and that's what makes intelligence an abstract concept. Does intelligence exist? Yes, we know that people are more or less intelligent. So abstract concepts are not made up or imaginary. They are real, they are just difficult to measure. How do we measure intelligence? How intelligent are you? Is that question easier to answer than how tall are you? It's probably harder to answer. And we have a lot of different ways in our society that we measure intelligence. Height, we have one way to measure height. Now you may say, oh, actually we can measure in feet, inches, millimeters, meters, or centimeters. Yes, I understand that, but all of those things are consistent with one another. You can compare meters to feet. You can compare inches to centimeters. We can just convert from one unit into another unit. But it's still very simple. It's a tape measure and a stable height. But intelligence, we have a lot of different ways to measure intelligence. As high school students, we measure intelligence with the SAT test, with the ACT test, the COGAT, the ITBS. We have other kinds of what we generally call IQ tests, right? Then there are, psychologists have come up with concepts called multiple intelligences. All right? We've come up with a concept called, well, what is when you say how intelligent is somebody, we could say how emotionally intelligent they are, because somebody has come up with the idea of emotional intelligence, right? Then there's what we call street smarts, right? Street smarts. Okay, that person may not be book smart, but they're street smart, right? And the idea is that this idea of human intelligence is so abstract that we have probably hundreds of different ways to try and measure to find out how intelligent a person is. And that is a great indicator that intelligence is an abstract concept, where height is very clearly a concrete concept. Now, here's the issue. With abstract concepts, because they are difficult to measure, what we try to do is we try to come up with common ways of measuring abstract concepts. What we want to do is we want to make the measurement concrete. So even though the concept itself is abstract, we want to make the measurement concrete. And when we make the measurement of an abstract concept concrete, we call that an indicator. When we take something concrete and use it as the measure of an abstract concept, we call that an indicator. So the SAT test, all those multiple choice questions, and the ACT questions, and the ITBS, and the COGAT, all of these different tests are concrete. Those tests are concrete, but they're being used to try and measure something that is abstract. And that makes the SAT and the ACT indicators of intelligence. And in economics, we have a lot of very abstract concepts, and we're about to talk about a few of them in this class. And what we call so we come up with measurements for these abstract concepts, and those concrete measures for those abstract economic concepts are indicators, and we call them economic indicators. It's almost like these economic indicators are almost like measuring a person's pulse, their blood pressure, their temperature. You know how when you go to the doctor, one of the first things they do is they put the thermometer in your mouth. They want to know what whether you're about 98.6. They want to measure your pulse to see if it's too high or too low, and they measure your blood pressure to make sure that it's within the safe range. And those are indicators, those are health indicators. They're indicators to see whether you are healthy in general or not. Because if those numbers, if you have like 101 temperature and your pulse is at like 130 and your blood pressure is at like 170 over 120, they're going to say, oh my goodness, this person is not very healthy right now. We have to help them. We have to do something about it. We do the same thing in the macro economy. We have economic indicators where we do these mathematical calculations, and and the results, the answers to these mathematical calculations, which are concrete, are indicators of whether the economy is healthy or not. So now let's move into understanding what are these economic indicators and what is it that they are measuring.